God damn, that tattoo. It can't be real. Captain Jason Pierce stood frozen in the middle of Edwards Air Base, his gaze locked onto the muscular arm of an otherwise ordinary mechanic, but that tattoo was anything but ordinary. It was the emblem of a unit that had never been acknowledged, erased completely from military records. The man who bore it, Ethan Reyes, was supposed to be dead, or at the very least, supposed to have vanished off the map. And in that moment, the entire base knew a man who had been hiding in plain sight for 2 years had just been summoned back. By an oath that was never allowed to be forgotten, Ethan Reyes hunched beneath the chassis of a heavy MRAP, his left arm stretched out as he tightened the front axle bolt, sweat beading and trailing from his temple down into the darkened collar of his shirt. He pulled a rag across his hands, but it did little. Oil clung to every groove in his skin, seeping black into the edges of his nails. A smudge, accidentally stamped onto his cheek when he scratched the bridge of his nose, formed a faint line that looked almost like a warrior's mark. Outside, the roar of transport aircraft cut through the desert sky, mingling with the shouted commands of logistics troops drilling near the southern staging area of the base. At 36, Reyes was accustomed to solitude in a world of metal and mechanics. He arrived at the shop early, always earlier than the first person, and left late after the last. No one asked him why. No one dared. To the logistics personnel, he was Mechanic Reyes, not friendly, not rude, just precisely distant enough that others kept their space. They respected the efficiency of his work, but they avoided his gaze like one avoids unseen rip currents, never sure when something beneath the surface might move. He shared nothing of his private life, no social media accounts, never attended celebrations or swap stories. Those who tried to break the silence quickly realized the gap was unbridgeable. He could decode the hum of an engine as if it were speaking directly to him, yet remained utterly mute when someone asked, "What did you do before this?" What they didn't know, and didn't dare to guess, was that Ethan Reyes had not always belonged to the world of wrenches and torque guns. He had once walked in unmapped places, where darkness was so thick even radio signals died. He had carried other names, used other voices, and lived by missions that were never to be spoken of. His unit did not exist, his record was fabricated. Any achievements he'd earned, if they could even be called, that were preserved only in symbols that no one was ever meant to decode. The transition from a SEAL operator to a military vehicle technician wasn't the result of failure, it was a sentence self-imposed, a deliberate withdrawal. Because here, among gears, engine growls, and oxidized control panels, he found the silence the world he'd left behind could never offer. Every bolt he turned, every oil change he performed, was a quiet prayer for oblivion. Only one thing still betrayed him: the tattoo on his left forearm, a single-line serpent coiled around a compass star, inked in that old black dye field operators used when there was no time to choose an artist. The tattoo wasn't ornate, it wasn't meant to flaunt, but it was alive. Beneath the skin, through the calluses, it persisted like a cipher meant for someone weathered enough to recognize it. People might mistake it for the ink of fresh recruit who'd just come through boot camp, but if they stared long enough, they'd feel something off. Not about the technique of the tattoo, but about the gaze of the man who wore it, a look that had seen things unrecorded in military history, things that official archives had no memory of. Ethan Reyes never explained that tattoo, nor did he fully hide it. He let it peek out while he worked, as if it were part of his toolkit, nothing more. Yet the tattoo, with its clean, unembellished lines and the heavy silence wrapped around it, told a story longer than any military dossier. And one day, when someone recognized that tattoo, his entire life would have to be flipped over. Are you sure a person's tattoo is the only thing they're hiding?
Welcome to Veteran Best Stories, where the war ends, but the stories live on. From the foxholes to front porches, we honor the silent battles our veterans still fight. subscribe, and walk with us beyond the battlefield.
When a man does something too perfectly, people often assume he's hiding something. Lieutenant Colonel Nathan Harding was not a naturally suspicious man. He had worked with hundreds of technicians, logistics, specialists, and coordinators across military bases up and down the western United States. But there was something about Ethan Reyes that didn't resemble anyone else. Not because he was skilled, there were plenty of skilled people here, but because he never seemed to feel the need to prove that he was. During a routine midweek inspection, Harding followed Reyes as he troubleshooted a driveline issue on an armored Humvee. No diagnostic screen, no schematics. Just a few minutes of visual assessment and listening to the engine's subtle irregularities. And Reyes pinpointed a problem buried deep in the drivetrain, an issue that had left the engineering team stumped for 2 days prior. No praise was given, no expectant look for recognition. He fixed it, stood up, wiped his hands, and turned away as if it were just another boring daily task. Harding watched Reyes' movements, the way he held the wrench, the slight tilt of his head to catch a phantom sound from the machine, even the way he avoided direct eye contact with others. That wasn't the skill set of a mechanic trained in civilian technical schools. It was the reflex of someone who had once had to survive by instinct. That evening, Harding didn't go straight home. He stayed in the office and pulled up some old documents he had skimmed years ago. There was a test in Nevada, a covert 3-month operation mentioned only in reports with obscure origins and coded identifiers. The project was called Meridian. Purpose: to test the endurance and survival skills of special units in environments with no resupply, no signal, no official recognition. 6 survivors, no one named, a non-existent operation. In the report, a small detail made Harding pause. A short, untitled annotation. Internal unit identification via tattoo serpent coiled around compass star. Tattoo applied in enemy detention camp to conceal identity upon capture. Harding closed the file. His breath slowed. He remembered a morning a few weeks back when Reyes was washing his hands in cold water, sleeves rolled up. He had caught a fleeting glimpse of a faded tattoo beneath tanned skin. At the time, he hadn't given it thought. Now he couldn't stop thinking about it. A few days later, while Reyes inspected the hydraulic system of an armored vehicle, Harding stood at a distance watching. Not to surveil, but to study the man. Reyes worked in silence, as always. But this time, his gaze seemed deeper. There was something in that calm, no longer merely quiet. It was restraint, as if he was living with a countdown clock inside him. Harding didn't ask. He didn't intervene. But in the eyes of someone who had managed military personnel for years, he understood the man wasn't being hidden. He was hiding himself. Not out of escape, but because he had seen enough to know that silence was the highest form of action. That night, Harding typed a single line into his personal journal. No one chooses to live like a shadow unless they've been burned by light before. He duplicated the note about the tattoo, carefully placed it into an envelope, and locked it in the drawer. Reyes said nothing, but what he didn't say was beginning to resonate louder than any words. Have you ever met someone who, the longer you look, makes you realize you haven't truly seen anything at all? Dear audience, grab a glass of water and keep listening. There's more unexpected development ahead. Comment number 1 if you think the story is good, so we know you're still here. Sometimes, fate chooses an ordinary day to become a moment of destiny. That morning began like any other at Edwards. The sun was mild, and wind from the Mojave Desert swept across the parched vehicle lot, carrying a thin veil of golden dust that settled on every surface. Ethan Reyes was kneeling beside a FMTV transport truck, his hand gripping the rusted exhaust pipe, struggling to free a stuck pin that had seized from long neglect. The halogen light hanging from the shop ceiling glinted off his skin, highlighting streaks of spilled oil and a portion of the old tattoo, the serpent, coiled around a star clearly visible beneath the cuff of his rolled-up sleeve. At that moment, Captain Jason Pierce's footsteps echoed behind him. He had come to the base to audit the part-time personnel, those classified as unofficial, yet still granted access to logistical systems. A routine administrative task, until his eyes landed on that tattoo. Pierce froze. The first reaction wasn't recognition so much as reflex, like someone had just fit a rusted memory lock back into place. But one heartbeat later, everything snapped into focus. That symbol, simple, cold, was the mark of Meridian. He had last seen it on the blood-soaked arm of a teammate left behind in the Black Hollow operation. A tattoo known only to those who'd lived it. A survival cipher. A curse never spoken aloud. Reyes had no idea he was being watched. He bent lower, focused on the driveline connection. But that light and the unusually still presence behind him made him hesitate. He didn't immediately look up. He paused, remaining in position, as if some instinct was alerting him that something very old, very significant, had just stepped back into his life. Finally, he turned his head slowly. Eyes met eyes. No greeting, no formal military gesture. Just two men standing amid the pale work lights and cold metal, recognizing each other not by names, but by the silence of things no one dared to speak. Pierce gave a subtle, almost imperceptible nod and acknowledgement. Reyes returned the look, his expression vacant, neither denial nor confirmation. Simply the quiet acceptance of a man who had been dead in every meaningful sense and was now being called back to life, not by his choosing. The silence lasted no more than 3 seconds. But those 3 seconds were the red thread stretching from an unnamed battlefield to a peaceful mechanic shop, from betrayals endured to the memories of lost brothers in arms. Reyes turned back to his work as if nothing had happened. But that couldn't rewind time. That night, his name appeared on Pierce's internal log with a single 2-word annotation, confirmed. The next day, the old truck Reyes routinely drove was subjected to a full inspection. Its navigation system was updated. A new code was appended to the classified personnel roster. All of it happened, without anyone in the shop noticing. But Harding knew. He didn't need to ask. Just seeing Reyes walk in that morning, the look in his eyes had changed, no longer the gaze of a mechanic counting down to quitting time. It was the look of someone who had been handed back an old map, reoriented, ready. The question was no longer, who is he? It became, why has he been called back now? Not every battlefield echoes with gunfire. Some places carry a silence heavier than 1,000 detonations. The command office sat deep within Edwards. A small room, with no windows, its walls lined in ash-colored acoustic foam. There was only an old steel desk, 2 black leather chairs, and dim light leaking from a recessed ceiling fixture. In that space, there was no room for randomness. And that morning, it became the tomb for the last shell of Ethan Reyes. Captain Pierce arrived first. He placed a thin dossier on the desk. No cover, no markings, only 2 handwritten words in black ballpoint. Meridian. When Reyes entered, their eyes met briefly like 2 sentries exchanging watch at the border of memory. Pierce said little. He slid the folder toward Reyes. Inside were lists of names, blurred photos, and incomplete margin notes. 6 survivors. 4 who died after discharge suicide. Missing, unexplained illness. The remaining 2, Reyes himself, and 1 other, whose location could not be determined. Reyes flipped through each page. His finger lingered longer on 1 photograph. No expression crossed his face, but his gaze shifted like sunlight breaking through a thick cloud. Not sharp, but enough to know something was stirring beneath. He didn't ask why the dossier had been returned. He didn't ask why Meridian suddenly mattered again. He only nodded, a measured nod, as if he had just signed a silent pact with his own past. The meeting ended with a soft click of the door. No handshake, no farewell words. But there was no longer any doubt Reyes had been handed the torch back. The remaining question was where he would carry it. Back in the shop, Reyes did not resume work immediately. He retrieved an old tool chest, worn at the corners and dusted with dried paint. He placed the dossier in the bottom compartment, beneath screwdrivers and power sockets. Not to hide it, but to protect it, as if it were a bone within his own body. Then he used a small key, the kind only seen in early 90-second gear, and locked it. A simple action, yet each movement carried the deliberate slowness of someone performing a ritual. That afternoon, Reyes didn't go home as usual. He stood in the yard behind the shop, watching the sunset spread across the red sand. His left hand unconsciously tugged up his sleeve. The tattoo remained, the serpent coiled around the star. But for the first time in years, he looked at it not as the man who wore it, but as someone newly entrusted with a duty. It was no longer a personal mark. It was an oath. The line between merely existing and living rightly, the ember Reyes had kept smoldering, now beginning to blaze. He didn't decide anything in a flash. No dramatic move, no speeding out of the base, no call to Washington. But a small change was visible to anyone paying attention. From that day on, Reyes wore a different left glove, fingerless, so the tattoo could be seen more clearly while he worked. A symbol no longer hidden, a flag newly planted, quiet but unmistakable. If a man who once tried to erase everything now begins to preserve a part of it, what is really happening inside him? My beloved audience, stay tuned for the next part that will leave you amazed. Take a second to like the video, subscribe, and drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always exciting to see someone joining us from all over the world. Some actions don't originate from a decision. They erupt like reflex because they are the deepest part of a person who has never been separated from themselves. In the sweltering midday heat at Edwards, inside the South Maintenance Bay, an accident occurred. A civilian logistics worker recently reassigned from Tucson slipped while inspecting the cross brace beneath a heavy equipment transport truck. The hydraulic jack shifted off balance, slipped from its main axis, and the vehicle collapsed, pinning the victim tightly underneath. No one reacted in time. For the first few seconds, those nearby just stood frozen. No one knew what to do. The medical team was still up at the north end of the base. The lift was more than 2 warehouse aisles away. Time slipped by, and the victim began to suffocate. A weak, strangled cry echoed off the steel walls of the bay like a call from the bottom of a chasm. Ethan Reyes was on the other side of the warehouse then, holding a diagnostic kit, checking sensor circuitry. He wasn't looking, he was listening. But the sound of metal impact and the distorted shout cut through everything he understood immediately. There was no time to think. He tossed the kit aside and ran across the open floor as if instinct had been ignited. The young soldiers stepped aside, unsure why the silent man suddenly shot forward like a bullet. Reyes dove down beside the truck, assessing contact points with his eyes and ears. He saw the trapped man's foot twitching, an indicator that pressure was cutting off circulation. But the harder he tried to lift, the more wrong it became. Reyes knew there was only one way. Detach the axle, relieve the load, reverse the joint segment, and do it fast. He slipped into the tight space like a fisher, without hesitation. A few shouted for him to stop, too dangerous, the collapse could worsen. But Reyes didn't hear them. In that moment, he was no longer the Edwards base mechanic. He was a SEAL, someone who had crawled over fallen comrades, disarmed explosives from civilians' ankles, dressed wounds while surrounded. His fingers traced the joint, finding the misalignment between the support shaft and the load-bearing bar. With only a small wrench, he did what no one expected. Loosened the fundamental coupling, gently rotated the collapsed base enough to create a gap wide enough for the victim to be pulled free. Everything happened in less than a minute. Then the whole bay fell silent as if it too were holding its breath. Reyes didn't immediately stand. He let others pull the victim out and place him on a stretcher. Only when he saw the medics arrive and confirm the man was still breathing did he step back. His forehead was drenched in sweat. His hands trembled not from fear, but because the adrenaline drain was familiar to a body that had long lived in danger. Someone nearby, unable to contain their astonishment, asked, "Were you Special Forces?" Reyes didn't look up. He said just enough. "I helped because it was what needed to be done." No one said anything more. No one needed to. In that moment, the truth about Ethan Reyes no longer lived in the tattoo nor in a hidden file. It revealed itself through the action and exact intervention, reckless of personal risk, purely for another person's survival. From that day forward, people began to look at him differently, not as a skilled mechanic, but as a presence in ordinary life, one whose silence wasn't a void, but the weight of something larger. If action needs no name, is it because that name once carried weight beyond recognition? Honor rarely needs proclamation. It spreads on its own quietly, persistently, like the scent from a wound not yet healed. 3 days after the accident in the shop, whispers began to thread through the rest areas, watch posts, and mess halls across Edwards. "Is he a SEAL?" a logistics tech asked, eyes still on the checklist. "Someone says he survived an unrecorded operation," the support soldier murmured, then glanced around as if he'd just disclosed a state secret. Ethan Reyes's name had never appeared on any of the honor boards hung in the assembly hall. But over the past few days, the way people looked at him was changing. Not the scrutinizing stare from before, but a slowed gaze carrying reflection, a little hesitation, and a nameless kind of respect. Reyes didn't react. He still arrived early, left late, worked with rough hands and the same silent stare as always, but the atmosphere around him was different. The "Good morning, Reyes" greetings, once perfunctory, now felt real, measured, as if the speaker weighed each syllable. Lieutenant Colonel Harding, the man who had doubted him most, walked into the shop one late afternoon. No aide, no clipboard. He stood beside the workbench where Reyes was replacing a fuel sensor, hands in his coat pockets, as if searching for something hard to articulate. Finally, he said, "I'm sorry." That was it. No explanation, no justification, no contextual framing, a plain apology from someone who had held a bias now replaced with acknowledgement. Reyes didn't stop working. He simply nodded, like a man unfamiliar with praise, not expecting correction. But in his eyes, Harding understood. He heard it, and he accepted it. From that day, no one called him the strange mechanic anymore. Junior officers who had once kept their distance now dipped their heads in salute as they passed. Some young soldiers quietly placed a cup of coffee near his bench each morning, no name, no note, just a silent gesture of recompense. And in the shop, a small thing happened. On the west wall, where procedural charts and parts maps hung, a new small photo appeared. A gloved hand with exposed fingers, removing a pin during the accident. No face, no name, just the moment a man saved another. No one hung that photo. No one took it down. One early morning, Reyes stood before the photo for a few seconds. Not long, just long enough to recognize that some things don't need words to be remembered. He turned away and went back to work. But in his step was a fresh lightness, like someone who just lifted a slab of stone from his back. He didn't become a legend. He didn't need to. But he was seen not by title, but by character, and that for Reyes was enough. If a person lives in silence and others respond to that same silence with reverence, isn't that silence the most powerful declaration of all? Not everyone wears a rank, but each person carries their own battle to overcome. Ethan Reyes teaches us that titles can be forgotten, but character is always remembered not by what we say, but by what we do silently. Kindness doesn't need a microphone. It echoes in the way we save someone when no one is watching. And sometimes just one acknowledging glance is enough to heal an entire quiet life. Thank you for journeying with today's story. If you've ever met someone like Reyes, or if you yourself are living that way, please share in the comments. We're always reading, always listening. Hit subscribe so you don't miss more real, slow-burning, soul-stirring stories like this. One share from you might be the light for someone quietly living in darkness. And don't forget, silent sacrifice deserves to be heard.